we define learning analytics quite broadly, where we say it's the process where we're measuring, we're collecting data about learners and their experience and their context so that we can improve the teaching and learning process. Now, it's a clunky definition, but what we're trying to get at is that when an individual, an academic, it could be an analyst, it could even be a student, or it could be an administrator, but when they're working with data that's been generated through the learning process and their intention is to improve teaching and learning practices, that's learning analytics. So how about I start with you, Carolyn, and then Dragan and Ryan, each of you to respond to, does that definition capture what you think learning analytics is, or the kinds of things you engage in when you're involved in work?
So I think that's one way of looking at it. I guess as I have reflected on what it is that makes learning analytics distinct from any other kind of data mining, I think that at the level of what we actually do, the important thing is about how we represent the data that we're working with, that we need to be able to represent it in such a way that we're preserving what it is from that data that's going to tell us something meaningful about the learning process and the learning relevant experiences of the learners. So, for example, you can imagine that, and as is the case in my research, that you can learn something about how students learn in MOOCs by looking at their participation in the discussions. But you could use that data also to learn things about, you know, just how people behave socially in general, or what are markers of particular demographic groups. And even though it's data that was collected in a learning setting, you might not be asking those kind of questions. Now, I know that in your definition you said something about the ultimate application, but I think that if you looked at the kind of representations of that conversational data that lend themselves to questions about you know, demographic groups, or questions about social processes in general, you would try to capture different things about what was happening in that discussion than if what you are trying to find out is things about how people are learning through those discussions. So I think that in working with the data, that you will end up doing different things at a detailed level when you're doing learning analytics than just data mining in general, even if the data itself was the same data, just because you're asking different kinds of questions.
Great, thanks, Carolyn. Dragan, I'd like to hear your thoughts to your responses to the clunky definition of learning analytics we've provided learners in week 1.
That's a great point by some of these students. I mean, probably many of you are very well aware that learning analytics is a really new field, right? And so the Society for Learning Analytics Research came up with this definition. It's been a lot of research in the last several years. We came up with a lot of understanding with respect to learning analytics, and I think we are now maturing as a field, and we definitely need to have a better definition. One thing that I would encourage students to do in this course is to try to blog and to come up with their own definitions and understanding of the field of learning analytics. That will be a really important exercise. I think even for us in the Society for Learning Analytics will be a great feedback to see what other people see as the definition of learning analytics. For me, learning analytics is really something which helps us to understand and consequently optimize learning. Learning analytics is a natural extension of existing things that we are doing in education and learning sciences, and it provides us with the opportunities to use additional types of data. In the past, we've been always using data in educational research, but also in educational practice, which are, for example, at the end of semester questionnaires. Now we don't have to wait that. We can get data about students as learning unfolds. So we can then provide learners with real-time feedback about their learning activities, about their learning quality, etc. But in many cases, many individuals are associating learning analytics as strictly something which is to predict student success or to predict how many students will fail or not. That's an important topic, but that's not the only thing that learning analytics is about. Learning analytics is also to describe learning, to see what is happening, and then to provide personalized learning experience for every individual. So this is my quick take on learning analytics. George, over to you.
Thanks. I feel like we're like on a CB, you know, breaker. Anyway, Ryan, this is you were out of the gate early on this. In fact, you were doing work with educational data mining. for probably about 3 or 4 years before Solar came along in 2011. And you've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think you've written one of the definitive articles on what exactly happens in the process of educational data mining. So how would your definition of analytics differ from what we've been talking about?
Well, that's a good question. I think that everything everybody has said is stuff I agree with. I think the issue that Carolyn raised, for example, of how we transform the data and make it meaningful is a really interesting one, and I think that's different in education than in other domains of e-science. For example, I think that there's a lot of meaningful hierarchy and organization in educational data. I think that ultimately the goal of learning analytics and educational data mining is to figure out what we can learn about learners, about learning, and about the settings they're learning in to try to make it better. And I think that when learning analytics came onto the scene, it came onto the scene in large part because there were key things that EDM wasn't yet doing. I think that the themes of automated response to students and the themes of data mining supported science were there, but I think that the theme of including stakeholders and communicating our findings to learners and to instructors and to other people who need that wasn't there. So I think that there's a lot here. It's hard to capture it in one definition because there's lots of new data. It's coming in at a scale we didn't have before. We have new methods to handle it. And once we have learned something from that data, we've got to provide actionable information to online learning systems, to researchers, and to instructors and other stakeholders. So I think there's a lot of stuff to do here, and I think we're going to have fun stuff to work on for the next several decades.
Great, thanks for that summary, Ryan, and I agree there's a context that's different, and that's producing this growing interest in data, and that's having a substantial impact on how we ask, well, how we answer questions, really, educationally. How do we serve students timely and appropriate help when it's needed? How do we provide guidance to students that are perhaps not making it through the course pathway in an optimal type of an approach? But there's also a range of questions that arise, and these are certainly around privacy and ethics and the use of data that students may not be aware that are being used and that we're using from a research end or even just from a teaching and learning practice end. So there's a range of outstanding questions that exist.